How will we address the climate crisis? Climate One with Greg Dalton brings together advocates, influencers, and policymakers in empowering conversations that connect all aspects of the climate emergency, the individual and the systemic, the scary and the exciting, to help you understand the most critical issue of our time. Because addressing the climate crisis begins by talking about it.
President Biden's Infrastructure and Jobs Act is the biggest piece of climate legislation in U.S. history. Though ultimately smaller than first proposed, it still contains far more money for projects aimed at mitigating the climate crisis than the best legislation the Obama administration could get through. What did it take to get 19 Republican senators, not to mention Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema, to vote with the Democrats? And with the states being given great latitude over how to spend the money, will the billions available for highways negate any positive climate impacts? Up next, a conversation on what the infrastructure bill means for stabilizing the climate.
Sasha Mackler, let's begin with you. You work for a bipartisan organization founded by 2 Republican and 2 Democratic U.S. senators. How big a deal is the infrastructure package we've been waiting on for, how many years?
It's great to be here today. This is a really big deal, not only for energy and climate, but for the infrastructure system, for the economy generally here in the US. We've been waiting for, I would say, more than 20 years for an infrastructure bill. It seems like every week has been infrastructure week for a very long time. And we finally got this bill across the finish line. And it really does represent a step change in our public commitment to many parts of the economy, but especially for climate change. And I look forward to talking through why that is here today.
We'll drill into that. Carla Frisch, this is obviously a big win for the Biden administration. We'll drill into the details on this show, but how will this package cut climate-eating emissions?
This bipartisan infrastructure law is a very significant investment in cutting emissions. And at DOE, we like to call ourselves a solutions agency, in that we work on a lot of the technologies and systems that will do just that. And for us, the bipartisan infrastructure law includes historic investments and represents the single largest change to our agency since our founding in 1977.
Beth Osborne, you issued a statement after passage of the Infrastructure Act saying, quote, "It will fail to produce meaningful shifts on climate and equity." Why do you say that?
Well, the change in the bill on the vehicle side is wonderful and exciting, but it's very status quo on the transportation program. It has taken a decades-old transportation program that's produced very poor results in both equity and climate, but also in safety, in terms of building local economies, in terms of dividing usually Black and brown communities, in terms of giving people equitable access to jobs and services, in terms of costing people a lot of money. It's performed very poorly in all of those areas, and we're hoping for a different result from basically the same programs. Now, that's going to depend on exactly how aggressive USDOT is using their administrative capacity and authority. And it's also going to depend on how much each of the 50 states wishes to change their behavior and investment.
Okay, so yeah, states get a lot of say in this. So Carla, I recognize you are with the Department of Energy, not the Department of Transportation, but can you respond to what Beth says there?
One thing Beth is pointing out is this is one step of investment. So we've got the bipartisan infrastructure law, which has passed and been signed by the president, and we are very excited about. And then the second piece is the Build Back Better Act, which just passed out of the House. And that includes additional investments. But today, I think we're talking about the bipartisan infrastructure law. And I will point out, it makes the largest federal investment in public transit in history, and the largest federal investment in passenger rail since the creation of Amtrak, and really significant investments in EV, both the charging and also at DOE on the supply chain for electric vehicles.
Sasha Mackler, these are big numbers, and yet there's 110 billion for new spending on highways, roads, and bridges, while there's 39 billion for public transit. 86% of the population in the US lives in urban areas where good public transit can play a big role in getting people out of cars and cutting climate-eating pollution, improving public health. So is it a good thing we're still spending 3 times more on car infrastructure rather than public transit, acknowledging that the numbers are big, but the proportions are still car-centric?
Well, it's true that the proportions are car-centric, and but I think what we really need to do is look at the trajectory here. The investments are really stepping up across the board in infrastructure for transit. And that's going to make a big difference. And as we look ahead to how this country will grow over time and will reduce emissions, we need to find ways to get the emissions out of the vehicle fleet. And this bill will do just that.
Beth Osborne, your organization says that states often choose to spend federal dollars on expansion over highway repair. It's more appealing for a politician to cut a ribbon or point to a new highway than it is to a repaired bridge, or perhaps a scheduling system for a transit agency. Is this time any different? Is there going to be a bias toward expansion over repair?
I certainly think we can all hope that everybody woke up the morning of the signing of the bill and was transformed by the hope for the future. But in my experience, they need a little bit of a push in that direction, and this bill offers none. In fact, this effort rejected an effort on the House side to say that before a state could build new capacity, they had to demonstrate they had a plan for maintaining it along with the rest of their system. We require that on the transit side. On the highway side, we have and we continue to allow a state to say, we have no idea how we'll maintain it, and we're going to give up on other pieces of infrastructure. And that has been maintained. The fact of the matter is that this and approach to transportation will invest a historic amount of money in transit and a historic amount in highways in a 1950s approach has never produced the results that we are hoping for. We really need to invest according to a goal or an outcome, not just according to pouring amounts of money in individual pots. That's not how people travel, and the climate gods will not care that this was a historic amount of transit funding if the historic amount of highway funding results in greater emissions.
Carla Frisch, let's talk about the states. The states may not be so bipartisan. A lot of states, there's red states and blue states, some purple states, but your take there on how this is implemented in the states and the flexibility they have in those political contexts, Carla.
Right, well, the states have an important role here. And as Sasha was pointing out, we have seen climate action from all parts and levels of society in the US. So we've seen state governments, local governments, private sector actors, regardless of party affiliation, really stepping up to the plate and taking action on climate, because they know that will deliver for them and their community sustainable prices, more job opportunities, and better health outcomes. Now, the design of this bipartisan infrastructure law does provide significant opportunities at the state level. So some of the dollars move through formula to states. Some dollars will be delivered competitively to states, to city and local governments, to tribal governments, and to their partners. And some of that will go out immediately. Some of it requires new program design, so it will take a little bit longer. But one of the unique aspects of this bipartisan infrastructure law compared to even 2009 American Recovery and Reinvestment Act is about the time frame. Because most of the programs in this law are looking at a 5 to 10 year time frame. So a sustained investment in competitiveness for the United States. It's not a one-time infusion of dollars. It is sustained over that time period.
Right, right, yeah, and so that one reason why maybe it won't have the huge hit on inflation that some people are worried about. Sasha Mackler, counties are the biggest operators of road and transit systems in the U.S. They cheered the passage of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, yet transit systems have been hit hard by declining ridership during COVID. How is this going to impact transit systems? We've discussed $39 billion, light rail and buses around the country. How's this going to affect transit?
Well, I think, it'll help to modernize transit, which should make it more appealing to use. I think that's really kind of the key insight and the core priority here. You know, and as we look ahead, it's not just transits, although that is important. It's also the decarbonization of fuels and the build out of a 21st century grid that can support EV infrastructure charging. All of those, transportation policies need to fit together. And this investment in these programs in the infrastructure law, I think are really kind of gearing up to not only deploying capital into the infrastructure that will be used, but also in building out the supply chains so that those technologies, those systems, and those jobs are created here at home. So it's also an economic policy that's really important for maintaining support for these programs and so that most Americans realize the benefits of these investments.
Speaking of EVs, we have a listener who's watching the live stream as we're recording this. Carla asks whether high gas prices might support the shift of people out of gasoline cars and make electric vehicles more price competitive. There's something about about $1 a gallon equivalent for running an electric car. That's pretty good when gas is up $5, even reaching $6 in some places.
Right. I think that's the important point there is what will drive consumers toward electric vehicles are those benefits of the electric vehicle. So they're highly efficient. They significantly reduce the operations and maintenance costs. So if you think about an electric vehicle, you don't have to change your oil. You're doing a lot less maintenance. And the cost of refueling an electric vehicle with electricity is significantly less than gas. Now, in the bipartisan infrastructure law, there are investments in building out a national network of electric vehicle charging to make that charging accessible to anyone wherever they want to go in an electric vehicle. And then in particular at the Department of Energy, there's an investment in the supply chain for those batteries that go inside electric vehicles. So all the way from raw materials to production to end of life, making sure that we are set to build and use those here in the United States.
Beth Osborne, 100 years ago, streets were the domain of people, horses, and a few automobiles, and then cars took over. COVID has helped reclaim paved public space for people with slow streets and street closures and restaurants spilling into curbside parking spots. Does this Bipartisan Infrastructure Act do anything to ensure spending on complete streets, including people and dogs, as well as automobiles? Tell about the power.
There's a very small amount of money available for that. I should be clear, it's an incredibly flexible program. All of the money could be spent on complete streets. They never have been before. They're unlikely to suddenly do so now. The general approach to addressing a problem in transportation is to say we should create a program to fix identified problem. For example, climate emissions. So we'll create a $6 billion climate emissions reduction program, and then we'll spend $50 billion a year on the traditional thing that drives up emissions. And we do the same with complete streets. Here's $2.5 billion a year for safety, and here's $50 billion a year for not safety. And so I think it's going to take more than money. Money has never solved this in the past. We've tried it over and over. We get the same promises. It really requires policy, and that's going to rely on the administration to lay down the law in the way they implement these programs. And there's a lot of things they can do. There's a bunch of cities that have experimented during COVID and had some really good experience, but their state runs this program again by the way it was designed by Congress. And states often stomp on the city's desires to create that kind of environment. And it will be up to USDOT to tilt the scales a little bit more in favor of those local governments or to help the states recognize these benefits.
Sasha Mackler, how big a deal is this grid modernization? We have a grid that is vulnerable to cyber attack. We have a grid that is kind of built for the 19th century, not so much for renewables that come and go over different times of the day. Talk to us about the grid and how we can really expect a modern grid out of throwing money at it.
Well, so yeah, the grid does need to be built out, hardened, and expanded, and that requires investment, which the infrastructure law, does have as a part of it. There's also some provisions in this law that center on the permitting side and the planning side of the grid, because, I think when you start to unpack this issue of how we electrify, which I share the view that the more we electrify, generally the better it is for climate emissions and for energy efficiency, and probably for cost as well. We need to have the tools to build the electricity grid more quickly than we can today, because if you're involved in the energy sector, that it is extremely difficult, time consuming, and more expensive than it needs to be to try to site and build and finance long distance, high capacity power lines. And so improving the permitting process is really one of the core things that we can do to help with the energy transition. It's not very well appreciated. And this bill does do some really important things there. It creates an Office of Transmission Planning at the Department of Energy. It has new financing authorities to help to get developers into the mix and take those risks in terms of trying to develop these projects. And it has some, I think, really significant bureaucratic changes around permitting and federal coordination of the permitting process, so that these projects don't get hung up in red tape and can move through still with the right environmental safeguards, but just move more quickly, because we need to really race to get this infrastructure built out. And the enabling pieces, the infrastructure, the electric transmission is really key to all of that. And so we're starting to crack that nut here with this bill. There's more to be done, but that's, those are some of the ways in which this bill can help.
Carla Frisch, we've been talking about this. There's this infrastructure that's now a law package, 1.2 trillion, 1 trillion, but some of that's new money, some of that's kind of money rolling forward. Help us unpack, what's really new in this and what's kind of, I guess, previous multi-year authorization.
So the total authorization for the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law is $1.2 trillion. And 550 billion of that is new spending. And that the law was agreed to and voted on by Democrats and Republicans, who agreed that we need these historic investments to make our country stronger and really help us with our competitive edge globally. So within those dollars, there's lots and lots of investments. And I think your listeners know that there's no one solution on climate change. And you see that throughout this law, there's several investments in lots of different technologies and systems that are going to help us deliver those emissions reductions and at the same time support good paying jobs.
Sasha Mackler, Joe Biden's popularity is sinking. However, a recent Politico Morning Consult poll found that Americans overwhelmingly support the bipartisan infrastructure package that we're talking about by a margin of 23%. We talked about gas prices and presidential popularity, but what does this popularity of this particular bill mean for implementation?
This bill really does create kind of a step change for the American energy innovation system in particular, where there will be new programs, new resources deployed to some of the most important challenges we face as a country as we look towards remaining competitive economically in the 21st century. That will be defined by how quickly nations can decarbonize and export those technologies to other parts of the world. The programs need to be designed well. The investments, need to go into projects that deliver, and that implementation will be complicated, right? And so the private sector needs to work with the public sector here, with the DOE, arm in arm to get these programs, to get these investments and these projects moving. What we're seeing the beginnings of here, I would argue, is really a uniquely American approach to climate innovation, where we see in other parts of the world, for example, in Europe or in China, a very top-down public sector approach to dealing with climate change. Here in the US, what we're seeing is the private sector, investment capital, entrepreneurs at the center of what we will begin to witness as a rapidly, I think, innovating and decarbonizing energy system. And the Department of Energy is really going to be shepherding and catalyzing a lot of these things going forward. And the implementation of these dollars over the next 5 to 10 years will be now the next important step in delivering these technologies for industrial scale decarbonization.
Well, Carla Frisch, what are we talking about? Are we talking about battery cars that are not lithium ion? Are we talking about biofuels that actually work? Are we talking about new forms of nuclear? Tell us a little bit about these innovations. Where are the dollars being directed?
All of those and more. So that's a good starting list. So one thing that the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law does is invest in clean energy demonstrations through the Department of Energy. And demonstration is a really important step in the technology development process. So you start with the research, then you do the development, and at the demonstration stage, you're doing the first of a kind, or a commercial scale project, but it's not quite ready for private sector investment. You got to test it out. You got to make sure it works before you get to the deployment phase where you are having private sector investors ready to go all the way in. So in that demonstration step, the law invests $21+ billion, and that includes clean hydrogen demonstrations across the country. It includes carbon capture, both direct air capture, pulling carbon out of the air, and industrial emissions reductions. It includes advanced nuclear demos, and it includes demonstration projects in rural areas and a set aside for demonstration projects in economically hard-hit communities. And one of our principles at the Department of Energy is thinking about place-based investments. So we're thinking about how can we get the technology to the next level, to where it needs to be. But at the same time that we're doing that, how can we make sure that those demos are in communities across the country, and diverse communities across the country that have the particular characteristics and skills that can support that kind of technology. There's an opportunity here, both on the technology front and on the community front.
As we wrap up, I want to look ahead and ask, first starting with Beth, what was shifted to the Build Back Better legislation? We know that there was a lot of climate things in this infrastructure bill that got shifted to the other bigger one, a lot of big climate in there. What are you looking at that was shifted out of this, and what are the prospects for that getting through? Because now it's been passed by the House, it's at the Senate.
Yeah, there's some additional money for electrification. Something when gas prices are going up is incredibly important. I'd point out, though, that gas prices is a very small portion of the cost of owning cars. So maybe we can also seek ways to reduce people's reliance on cars. And another part of the Build Back Better proposal is a provision to connect people in affordable housing with higher quality transit. It's $10 billion. It is not only an important provision, it is a restoration of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Agreement. They agreed to $49 billion, and it was the only thing they abandoned in the bill of the bipartisan agreement announced at the end of June. They held close to everything else, but they went ahead and took one little additional cut out of transit. So it's a restoration of that original agreement that I hope stands, will be important to really move the needle so that transit is a higher portion of the overall proposal. We really hope to see that. I'll also point out there's some money for high-speed rail as well, which would be important to having a really world-class rail.
Carla Frisch, what do you see that's in the Build Back Better, the new plan making its way possibly through the Senate? What are the most important climate provisions you see there?
Well, in the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, we see significant investments in climate. Those demonstration the demonstration of clean energy technologies that we talked about. There's investments to keep the carbon-free power that we have. So there's investments in keeping our existing nuclear plants operating safely and our existing hydropower dams increasing their efficiency and safety. And there's investments in enabling infrastructure, the transmission, the EV infrastructure, also carbon dioxide infrastructure for storing carbon dioxide. Now that's what's passed. Now you're asking about the Build Back Better Act, which has passed the House. So there's a significant additional climate and clean energy investments in that Build Back Better Act that would really accelerate our progress toward our goals. So that includes further investment in efficiency, both at the homeowner level and the appliance level, and also at industrial facilities. There's further investments in resilience and EV infrastructure. And then the really significant piece is the clean energy tax package. So significant tax credits for individuals shifting towards clean energy and electricity or in transportation, and also significant, very significant market shaping tax policy for the private sector to really accelerate the investments in solar and wind and many other clean technologies. So that, as Sasha said, would be the thing to watch coming up in the Build Back Better Act, is that tax package.
Right. Sasha, last word, things you're looking for, the big climate things in the Build Back Better?
Yeah, well, I think Carla just hit the nail on the head. If you're looking at the Build Back Better bill, that tax package is really the heart and soul of the next step of our climate agenda, which is reducing the costs of clean energy technologies for deployment. The infrastructure bill is all about building the technologies and the demonstration projects. The next bill, the Build Back Better bill, if it passes and gets signed into law, will be focused on lowering the costs so we get that deployment of clean energy technologies and the protection of our nuclear fleet through a tax credit that would keep existing nuclear plants open. Really important for maintaining our footing as we look ahead for decarbonization. And then I think the step after that, how do we then create the frameworks for that for the long term, in terms of how do we take advantage of those low costs, of the innovation pipeline that we're just getting in place? And then are there things like a clean energy standard, other industrial policies that really help to channel the energies and the capital in the private sector towards the long term, which again, I would argue would be net zero by mid-century.
Podcasts of this and other Climate One shows are available wherever you get your pods. Talking about climate can be awkward, also can be exciting, as you've seen today. Please help us get more people talking about it by giving us a rating or review. Thanks for joining us online. We'll see you next time, everybody.